The Town That Vanished Without a War Mysterious History for Sleep Chapter 1. By the time Elias Vale saw the first roof of Brackenby, the sun had already gone pale behind the western ridge, and the road had fallen so quiet that even the mule seemed unwilling to place its hooves too loudly on the stones. He drew the animal to a slower pace without meaning to. Nothing moved ahead of him except the last strip of smoke unraveling from a chimney near the square. That smoke bothered him at once. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant hands to tend it. Yet the lane below the hill showed no children, no dogs barking from yards, no woman calling from a doorway, no cart turning, no crow startled upward. The town lay before him with the stillness of a painted scene. Sergeant Mira Holt rode behind him in her plain dark coat, a sword at one hip and a short carbine wrapped against the damp. She had spent 12 years in border companies and had the rare military gift of looking bored while being ready for the worst thing in the world. She glanced at the chimney and then at the bell tower. "No bell," she said. "No people," Elias answered. "And yet a fire." He did not like that she sounded less surprised than he felt. The order that had sent them north lay folded inside his satchel under sealing wax and dampened map sheets. Elias had been commissioned by the Royal Office of Roads and Measures to inspect Brackenby, update the grain routes that passed through the valley, and if the reports were true, explain why no tax collection, church tithe, message rider, or salt convoy had come out of the place in 11 days. The first rider sent to inquire had reached the fork south of town and turned back after hearing that every house stood open. The second rider had not turned back. He had been found 3 miles away wandering in the marsh road, white with fear and incapable of saying anything clear except that Brackenby was full of meals and empty of mouths. So the office had sent a map maker. And because the office did not trust map makers to survive anything more dangerous than rain, the office had also sent Mira Holt. The two of them entered the first lane just as evening took the color out of the fields. A laundry line moved a little in the wind between 2 cottages. One shirt still hung there. A bucket sat by a well. A hoop for a child's game lay on its side in the dirt. Elias watched for any sign of haste, any broken latch or smashed shutter, anything that would say flight or struggle. Instead he found order. The doors were not hacked open. The gates were unbroken. A broom leaned against one wall where it had been set down by careful hands, not thrown. He stopped outside the cooper's yard first. 3 half-finished barrels waited beneath the eaves. Inside the shed, tools lay on a bench. A knife had been sharpened so recently that metal filings still glittered on the wood. The cooper himself was nowhere. They crossed to the small square where the market stones formed a ring around the old pump. Brackenby was not a large town, only 43 houses by the last registry, with a church, a granary, an inn called the Lantern and Stag, 2 long barns, a schoolroom attached to the church wall, and 1 square watchtower built in a meaner century when raiders had last mattered in the valley. The tower bell hung silent. Its rope moved slightly in the breeze. Elias stared at the rope. Mira noticed. "You think someone rang it?" "I think someone stopped needing to." The inn door stood open. They went there first because that is where all roads inside a town end, whether they admit it or not. Inns collect what people say, what they hide, what they owe, what they dream, what they regret, and what they are prepared to confess only after the 3rd cup. The common room smelled of yeast, ash, and spilled stew. 5 bowls sat on tables. One had gone hard with a skin across the top. One still held a spoon resting against the rim. One had been dropped and cracked on the floor, but not in violence. It had slipped, nothing more. A heel of bread rested near the window. A candle had run down in its iron holder and drowned itself in wax. Elias felt the strange cold that does not come from weather but from finding ordinary life interrupted without explanation. He touched one bowl, long cold. In the kitchen, A loaf stood finished on the board. Beside it lay a knife and a sprig of rosemary. The back door opened to the yard where hens pecked among nettles as though nothing had happened. A cow in the lean-to lowed once when Mira stepped too near, then returned to chewing. So they did not take the animals, she said. No, people fleeing war take what can move. There was no war here. Then perhaps they did not flee. Elias turned on her. You think they were taken? Mira met the question with that same soldier's flat calm. I think a town does not melt like frost. Something made these people leave, or something prevented them from remaining. The difference matters later. He hated that she was right. They searched until dark thickened in the corners. At the church they found the altar cloth folded, the poor box locked, the prayer book stacked. At the schoolroom they found slates wiped clean and one piece of chalk snapped in two upon the desk. In the mayor's house they found ledgers, a teapot, half-sewn sleeves, and a pair of spectacles laid neatly beside an open account book. In the blacksmith's yard the forge had burned down to pale ash. In the baker's shed 12 rounds of bread hardened slowly on the rack as if the town might yet wake hungry. Not a body, not a blood mark, not a dragged trail, not one sign of burning, theft, forced entry, hurried packing, or cavalry. When the night wind came down from the ridge, it carried the smell of peat, apples, and distant water. Somewhere in the dark above the valley, an owl called. Elias stood in the center of the square and looked up at the windows. He had the absurd sense that the town was watching him from behind its own emptiness. They set their camp in the inn because any other place felt more intrusive. Mira barred the door and checked the shutters. Elias lit 2 lamps and laid his papers out on the largest table as if doing normal work might pull the world back into sense. He copied the names from the registry and said them aloud without quite meaning to. Agnes Marrow, widow, mayor by charter. Tomas Reed, bellringer and sexton. Joran Pike, ferryman. Marta Fenn, baker. Sister Elin, physician. Henrik Dace, cooper. Lysa Thorne, schoolmistress. 47 households, 211 souls, a town small enough to know the sound of every footstep after dusk. Mira sat by the window sharpening a knife with long, patient strokes. You always read names like that. Only when I do not wish them to become numbers. She looked at him for a moment and then went back to the blade. Sleep while you can. He almost laughed. In here. In here at least the roof is honest. The first sound came an hour after midnight, not from outside. From above. 3 slow knocks somewhere in the upper floor, deliberate and spaced as if made by the same hand testing 3 different boards. Elias froze with the registry open across his knees. Mira was on her feet before the 3rd knock ended, knife gone, sword half drawn. She held up one hand and tilted her head. Nothing. Then, faintly, a soft rolling sound overhead like an object settling by itself. She took the lamp. He took the second, hating that his hand trembled. The inn stair complained beneath them. At the landing the corridor ran black in both directions, with 6 guest rooms facing each other and one narrow attic ladder at the end. The air smelled of old linen and dust. Mira checked the nearest room first. Empty bed, empty chest, washbasin dry. The next room, empty. 3rd room, empty except for a child's carved horse left beneath the blanket. At the attic ladder she paused. Elias stood behind her with the lamp held too high and the flame shaking in the draft. She climbed. He heard one board groan, then another. Silence followed, long enough for his heart to turn stupid. Then her voice came down, quiet and almost annoyed. Come look at your ghost. He climbed after her into the low attic. A single apple had rolled from a split crate and come to rest against a beam. Nothing else moved. He let out the breath he had been storing since the square. That is not funny. No, Mira said, but it is useful. Fear has already begun making choices for us. He was about to answer when she pointed to the far wall. Someone had scratched a line into the wood beside the narrow attic window, not a mark of tallying. Words. Elias held the lamp close. We left before the bell. The letters were rough, cut with a knife in haste or secrecy. He read them again and again. Mira's face did not change, but he saw the small shift in her eyes. "What bell?" he whispered. Outside, beyond the town and beyond the dark marsh fields, something answered him. Far away. A single low note, not loud, not near, but unmistakable. A bell. Chapter 2. The sound did not come again that night. Elias stood at the attic window until the cold damp reached his sleeves and the lamp began to smoke, but the valley gave him nothing more. The darkness outside was whole. No torch moved on the road. No second bell answered the first. If there was a tower in the marsh or a chapel in the hills or a mule team somewhere beyond sight, it kept its secret. Mira made him come down before dawn. "Whatever rang, it is still there in the morning," she said. "That assumes I could sleep before morning. That assumes sleep matters." They waited only until the sky turned from black to iron. Then they walked the square again, this time with light enough to reveal small things. Morning made Bracken be stranger, not gentler. By night the town had seemed suspended. By day it looked paused in the middle of a sentence. The pump rope remained damp from recent use. The loaves in the baker's shed had drawn flies. In the lane behind the schoolhouse, fresh weeds had not yet pushed into wagon ruts. The tracks led north toward the meadows and vanished where the ground hardened. Elias returned to the inn to examine the ledger. The landlord, one Pieter Vale, no relation despite the name, had kept a neat book. Travelers were listed by day, trade, horse count, and coin owed. Salt men from the coast, 2 wool merchants, a priest from Grenfell, 3 royal drovers in midsummer, then fewer and fewer entries as autumn drew on. The last visiting name had been written 12 days before Elias arrived. Brother Cal, collecting tithe accounts, paid in silver, room upstairs, departed before first light, no remark beside the line. The final pages after that held only the inn's own tallies for ale, lamp oil, onions, barley, salt pork, and candles. Then the hand changed. A single sentence had been added beneath the final account, not in the innkeeper's clerkly script, but in larger, harder letters. "If they ask, tell them the bell rang east, not west." Elias read that sentence 3 times. "Do you know a Brother Cal?" he asked Mira. "No." "Any collector, scribe, priest, officer?" She shook her head. "The border companies know smugglers better than priests." He turned the book so she could read the line. Her mouth tightened. "That is instruction, not fear. It sounds like misdirection." "Same family." They spent the morning house by house. Elias noted every oddity in a field journal he had intended for bridge measurements and river widths. By noon it had become a catalogue of absence. At the mayor's house, he found the town seal wrapped in cloth beneath the account chest. That mattered. No mayor leaves with her seal unless she intends to govern elsewhere. But Agnes Marrow, widow and chartered mayor, had left it behind. At the church, Tomas Reed the bellringer had abandoned not only his keys but his coat. At the ferryman's hut by the river, Joran Pike had left both oars and the ferry chain attached, though the boat itself was missing. That bothered Mira more than anything so far. "You can leave a house," she said. "You can leave a chicken. You can even leave a loaf if you think you'll return. But a ferryman who leaves without his boat has already made a decision. Unless someone took it, then why not take the chain off cleanly? Why leave the iron ring scratched and twisted like that?" Elias knelt beside the landing post. The chain had indeed been unfastened in haste. Mud around the bank showed many prints layered over each other, too muddled for counting. Some were boots. Some were smaller, perhaps children. One wheel had sunk there recently, a heavy cart perhaps, then rolled away toward the reeds on the eastern side. He looked up. The eastern reeds opened toward low land and shallow water, then toward a band of mist that lay all day over the marsh like cloth over a sleeping face. No proper road ran that way. The map in his satchel showed only wet ground, willow pools, and the ruin marked Old St. Vay. He had almost dismissed that mark when he first reviewed the survey. The ruin was little more than a note from a map 40 years out of date, perhaps an abandoned chapel or a boundary stone misremembered by an elderly surveyor. Yet now the odd sentence in the inn ledger returned to him. Tell them the bell rang east, not west. Old St. Vay, he said. Mira followed his gaze. A ruin. On the old survey. Then we go there after we eat. They ate cold bread in the shadow of the ferry hut while the river passed without interest. Elias had always loved rivers on maps. They obey. They separate. They tell you where land ends and begins. This one now seemed to him like a witness refusing to speak. Before they left for the marsh, he stopped in the schoolhouse. The room was small and cleaner than most schools he had known. Lysa Thorne, the schoolmistress, had believed in order. A line of copybooks sat tied with twine. Geography boards leaned against the wall. One large teaching map, hand-painted and cracked at the folds, hung from 2 nails above the desk. Elias stepped closer. Brackenby was on the map, or rather the name Brackenby had been. Someone had scraped it away, not the whole town, only the letters. The dot remained where the town stood. The river remained. The ridge, the road, the small church icon, even the neighboring mill villages. But the word itself had been rubbed down with chalk and knife until only a pale scar crossed the parchment. He opened the copy books. Most held children's sums and clumsy handwriting. In 3 of them he found the same exercise from the week before the town fell silent. Draw the valley and name its places. The rivers were named. The hill pasture was named. The ford at Den Cross was named. Brackenby was not. Some children had left the place blank. Others had written home. One had written we go where the map has not. He closed the book slowly. Mira stood in the doorway. Tell me. He did. She listened without interrupting. Then they practiced leaving before they left. That makes no sense. It makes too much sense. Someone was teaching them not to be found. Elias wanted to argue, yet the evidence kept building its own hard shape. They walked east after noon. At first the ground held. Then it softened beneath the sedge and low willow. Brackenby's eastern edge gave way to damp meadow, then to channels where black water shone between mats of grass. The air changed there. The valley smell of bread, dung, ash, and apples faded. In its place came cold peat, wet roots, and the mineral breath of standing pools. The ruin of St. Vay stood on a rise no higher than a house. Only one wall remained upright, with half a narrow arch in the broken socket where a bell might once have hung. Stones lay scattered among reeds. Thorn vines had climbed the altar end. The place did not feel holy now. It felt forgotten in a patient way. No bell hung in the ruin, but prints showed recent use. Many people had come here within the last fortnight. Elias saw children's narrow soles, women's boots, a crutch mark, one ox cart wheel, and the deep step of a shod horse. The marsh preserved what the town square had lost. Mira crouched by the wall. Here, in the shadow of the broken arch, lay a patch of scraped earth. Not a grave, a place where something heavy had been dragged aside. Together they pushed the fallen stones until one shifted enough to reveal old steps descending under the rise. Cold air came up from the dark. Elias felt it on his face, not the simple cold of earth, but the deeper still cold of enclosed places where time does not circulate. A cellar, he said. A passage, Mira answered. She took the lamp from his hand. The steps led down into a tunnel lined with ancient stone, narrow but well made, older than the ruin above. Water dripped somewhere ahead. Moss glazed the lower blocks. On the wall at shoulder height, someone more recent had fixed iron hooks for lamps. Melted tallow still clung to one of them. People had used this passage very recently. They went no farther than the first turn because the floor beyond had collapsed under floodwater. Black water filled the tunnel knee-deep and reflected their light in restless gold. Pieces of rush torch floated there. A broken crate, 2 feathers, 1 child's ribbon. Elias crouched at the edge. On the far side of the water, cut into the slime with a stick or boot heel, he saw a mark. not letters this time. A bell, and beneath it an arrow pointing onward. He rose too quickly and struck his head on the stone. Mira caught his shoulder before he stumbled into the water. Steady. You think they went through here? They went this way or wanted someone to think so. He touched the wall, feeling the age of the stone. This passage is older than Brackenby. So is most trouble. Outside again, the afternoon had dimmed. From the rise of St. Vay they could see Brackenby spread below them, roofs pale under a lowering sky, smoke now gone from the last chimney. Beyond the western ridge, dark clouds banked like a wall. Suppose, Elias said slowly, suppose an old tunnel ran under the marsh or past it. Suppose the town used it to leave. With wagons, children, cows. Not cows, but people, small stores, whatever mattered most. Mira watched the town. That still leaves the question of why an entire town would choose a tunnel and a marsh over the open road. Elias looked toward the scraped name on the school map in his mind, and the line in the inn ledger and the words in the attic. We left before the bell. When the wind shifted, he thought for one moment that he heard the distant low note again, somewhere beyond the reeds. This time Mira heard it too. Neither of them spoke until it faded. At the ruin's threshold, almost hidden by root and moss, Elias found one more thing. A page from a book, folded twice and weighted beneath a stone. The paper was damp but legible. It had been torn from a household Bible. On it, in a woman's quick hand, someone had written, "No soldiers came. No plague carts came. No fire took us. Remember that when they speak of us later." Below that, a second line. We were not driven out. We chose the road no crown could measure. Chapter 3. Rain came that night, soft at first and then steady enough to turn every roof into a voice. They moved their search to the mayor's house because it had the driest study, and because Elias had begun to suspect that Agnes Marrow, whatever else she had been, was the one mind large enough to hold an entire town's decision. Her house stood on the north side of the square beneath 2 ash trees. It was not grand, only broader than the others, with a slate roof instead of thatch and 3 front windows looking over the market stones. A woman who governs a small place does not live like a lord. She lives like a person who is always being interrupted. The study smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Elias set candles in 2 sconces and opened every drawer in the writing table. Receipts, grain tallies, marriage records, a note about repairing the mill race, a complaint from the cooper about the weight of winter tax on barrel hoops, an unsigned petition asking that the Crown's recruiters be denied access to the Valley School. Nothing dramatic, all of it, in its way, dramatic. A town reveals itself most clearly in what it complains about. Mira stood by the hearth drying her coat. What sort of woman writes this much? The sort who knows that if she does not write it down, men in offices will say it never happened. That sounds like most women I have known. He smiled despite himself. Near midnight, he found a locked box hidden inside the false bottom of a flower chest in the kitchen pantry, a place no clerk would check and no thief would respect. The lock was simple. Mira opened it with a strip of metal from her kit and no visible pride. Inside lay 23 letters tied with blue thread. All were addressed to one person, Jonas Marrow, at present wherever the road keeps you. Her son, Mira asked, must be. None of the letters had been sent. Some were folded and sealed. Others were only half finished. One had a thumbprint of flour on the margin. Another smelled so strongly of rosemary that Elias wondered whether Agnes had stored herbs beside it, or whether she herself had always carried that scent with her. He read the earliest first. "My son, the valley has had a thin summer, but not a cruel one. The apples are mean little things and the hens have begun pecking each other, which always happens when the weather cannot decide between heat and storm. Tomas says the old marsh path is showing again where the reeds fell back. Joran says Tomas drinks too much. They have both been right before. Lysa sends word that the children draw better maps than the tax men. I believe her. They have never once put Brackenby in the wrong place. That line struck him because of what he had seen in the schoolhouse. He read on. A collector from Grenfell came and asked too many questions about stores and grain. I answered too few. If you intend to write your mother any useful advice, now would be a good season to begin. The next letters darkened by degrees. Late harvest. 2 recruiters seen west of Den Cross. One carrying a list. A rumor that the king's need for men would outrun his need for mercy. 3 local boys speaking bravely about war without ever having smelled it. A note that Ferriman Joran had been asked how many people could be moved across the eastern channels in one night, and by whom he refused to say. A line about the bell at St. Vay sounding once in clear whether though no bell stood there now. Mira sat down across from him when he read that aloud. Again, she said, he did. She believed it. I do not know. Read more. He unfolded a later letter. Jonas, I have begun to understand that a town can die while every inhabitant remains breathing. It happens when the place no longer belongs to those who keep it alive. You were fortunate to leave before seeing what men with maps can do when backed by men with muskets. They call it measuring. They call it order. They call it roads, levees, fair division, grain efficiency, river rights. Then they count your sons, then your stores, then your beasts, then the nails in your door if you let them stand long enough. Do not think me old and frightened. I know the difference between burden and rule. We have carried burden before. What approaches now is rule. Elias set that page aside for a long moment. He had spent his life making maps. He knew their beauty, their usefulness, their terrible appetite. He had never heard it stated so cleanly by a widow in a valley town, and the truth of it shamed him more than accusation would have. Mira watched his face. You are taking that personally. I am a man with maps. You are a man reading someone else's fear after the fact. Fear often has better eyesight than comfort. They read until the rain eased. The final 5 letters were never sealed. In them, Agnes wrote not as a woman worried about what might happen, but as one already arranging what must. The fairies will not serve. The children cannot keep quiet that long on open water. The old passage below St. Vay is partially flooded but passable to the fork if planks are set in place. Joran swears the Roman stones continue beyond the wet and rise again under the east bank. Whether he learned that from his grandfather or from some wine-fed liar, I cannot yet say. Lysa has begun new geography lessons. She says a map teaches obedience before it teaches distance. I asked whether the opposite can also be true. She smiled in that way teachers do when they believe they are speaking to slow people. Sister Alin says the bell may be memory and not metal. I told her memory has moved heavier things than metal. We have had 3 meetings after dark. 27 favor leaving before the roads close. 9 say winter will kill us sooner than recruiters. 4 say the crown will never notice a place as small as ours. Those 4 have never met the crown except on coin. 1 page bore only a list of names with marks beside them. Ready, not ready, will follow, must be told last. No one had been forced. That much grew clearer with each page. Agnes had been counting consent. Near the bottom of the list a name had been crossed out so hard the paper tore. Brother Cal, not a resident, a visitor. The tithe collector from the inn ledger. Elias leaned back. He was here when this happened, he said, or just before. He may have seen their preparations, which would explain the line in the ledger he had to be misled. He found another page tucked into the thread bundle. Not a letter, but a memorandum in Agnes's hand. If the collector writes south, we are lost. If he suspects a western road, we are seen. If he hears the east bell, he follows the marsh and drowns in it or turns back. If he believes we waited for war, he will not understand that peace can also be a noose. He felt an odd admiration for her then, the way one might admire a general without wishing to be ruled by one. Outside, the square remained empty under wet darkness. They slept in chairs and woke sore. Morning opened gray and windless. Elias went to the church next because Agnes's letters named Tomas Reed often enough to suggest that the bellringer had been more than a keeper of ropes. The church of St. Aldwyn was plain stone, square naved, practical, the sort of building raised not to inspire awe but to survive weather. Tomas's room lay off the sacristy. Within it Elias found a narrow bed, 3 spare shirts, a chessboard missing 1 bishop, dried herbs hanging from the beam, and a journal bound in cracked brown leather. The first pages were full of ordinary notes, funerals, roof leaks, births, whether the south hinge of the bell tower required oil. Then summer became autumn and the entries changed. 15 harvest month. Dreamt again of hearing a bell from under earth, not above, below, woke with hands shaking though the room was warm. 17 harvest month. Agnes says I am not to repeat such nonsense in the square. I reminded her I only speak it because I have heard it. She asked whether hearing has ever once prevented nonsense. 20 harvest month. The children heard it too. Lisa pretended not to notice. I think she noticed most of all. 24 harvest month. Brother Cal arrived with the smile of a man who counts other people's bread by imagining it already his. 27 harvest month. Check St. Vay with Joran. No bell there. Yet the arch carries sound in odd ways. The tunnel below is open farther than before. Water lower. Old stone still true. 1 frostwane. Rang our own tower at dusk and again at dawn as usual. At midnight heard an answering note from east. Lower than ours. Slower. Joran crossed himself. I laughed and disliked the sound of my own laugh. Elias read that line twice. Mira, leaning against the doorway with her arms folded, said nothing. Later entries showed Tomas moving from fear into participation. 5 frostwane. Agnes says if the town leaves, the tower bell must ring at dawn as always so that any watcher south of the ridge hears normal morning. She asked whether I could rig the hammer to do so after we were gone. I said yes, though my father taught me bells should not lie. She answered that bells have lied for kings often enough. 7 frostwane. Lisa told the older children not to write Brackenby on their maps anymore. She says names are how places get caught. 8 frostwane. Sister Elin treated little Mara Pike for fever. Child spoke in sleep. We go before the bell eats the hill. Elin says children collect adult dread and wear it as costume. 10 frostwane. I walked to St. Vay alone, heard no bell, heard water, heard my own steps. The trouble with silence is that it teaches a man how much noise he makes. Near the end of the journal, Elias found a loose paper folded inside the back cover. It was a sketch of the eastern marsh. Crude but useful. St. Vay marked at the rise, a line from the tunnel, a flooded chamber. Then beyond that, a second line drawn dotted and uncertain toward a phrase written in the margin. Old Abbey Road, if grandfather spoke true. Below it another note, do not bring lantern glass, cover all light. An abbey, Elias said softly, not only a ruin. Mira crossed to the desk. And beyond it. He showed her. She traced the dotted path with 1 finger. If there is higher ground east of the marsh, they could have moved unseen. He pictured it then, not a panicked crowd, but a procession. Wrapped lamps, children instructed beforehand, wheels muffled with cloth, the bell in the town tower rigged to speak after they were gone. A false sound from St. Vay to turn any pursuer east into the worst wet ground. A collector misdirected. A schoolmistress removing the town's name from maps before departure. Not a vanishing. A refusal. Yet even refusal must end somewhere. Where had 211 people gone after the marsh, into forest, into another valley, into an old abbey road no crown still measured? He opened the last page of Tomas's journal. It held only 1 sentence. When the town is empty, ring once for the dead and once for the ones clever enough not to become them. Chapter 4. By the 4th day Elias knew the sounds of Brackenby well enough to miss the ones that were gone. There should have been morning buckets at the pump. There should have been a latch somewhere struck twice by an impatient hand. There should have been the soft domestic quarrels that rise through village walls and dissolve before noon. Instead, he heard rain drying on slates, hens arguing with no one, wind through the ash trees, and once in the blacksmith's yard, the slow collapse of a stack of kindling that had stood too long untouched. He went again to the schoolhouse because silence had settled there in a different way than elsewhere. Other rooms looked left behind. This one looked prepared. Lisa Thorne had been the daughter of a survey clerk and the widow of a soldier, or so one of Agnes's letters implied. That explained, perhaps, why she understood both maps and laws. Her classroom held books in 3 stacks by age, sharpened reed pens, folded paper maps, and a box of smooth stones used for arithmetic. She had taught the children to keep order without cruelty. Elias could feel that in the room. Desks were not scratched with vulgarities. The stove had been cleaned before the town departed. Even the broken chalk appeared placed rather than discarded. In the cabinet beneath her desk, he found 12 copybooks of older pupils, a roll of lesson papers tied in green thread, and a personal notebook bound in gray linen. Its first pages were the private observations of a teacher who loved her charges and was too honest to call them angels. View and Pike lies about sums with the calm of a bishop. Mira Dace copies beautifully and understands nothing of longitude. Bren Marrow can find north in fog and should not be told this often. Young Sella drew the river with more truth than the official map. Then, scattered among such notes, came stranger entries. Agnes asked whether children can be taught to keep a secret without understanding it. I answered no. They can be taught to keep a duty. The small ones accept change if given a task. The older ones ask whether leaving means cowardice. I asked whether staying to be counted by strangers is bravery. They disliked me for that, which means the lesson may prove useful. Had them draw places they trust. Most drew kitchens. 2 drew the bell tower. 1 drew the marsh. That one sees farther than I like. Elias sat at the teacher's desk and imagined her writing while the schoolroom still hummed around her. He could almost hear scraping pens, muffled coughs, a child whispering, the stove ticking as it cooled. He unrolled the green thread lessons. They were map exercises, but not common ones. Not kingdoms, provinces, and the usual stiff nonsense of capitals and roads. She had asked the children to draw routes no stranger would choose. How to leave the mill by the sheep path. How to reach St. Vay without the south lane. Where reeds grow tall enough to hide a cart at dusk. Which stones in the river stand highest after hard rain. He read the headings in growing astonishment. Safe ground in mist. Places where wheels sink. Places where dogs bark. Houses with babies too small to walk. If 9 lanterns are covered, how much moon remains enough? Mira came in and leaned one shoulder to the frame. I know that face. What face? The one you wear when something clever offends you. He held up the lessons. She read several sheets, then gave a short breath that was not quite laughter. She trained them. She trained children. She trained a town. That was true. Brackenby had not vanished in a single night of improvisation. It had been educated into absence. The gray notebook contained a longer entry written perhaps a week before the departure. Elias read it slowly, hearing her voice form in his mind. We pretend history is made by declarations, bells, wars, signatures, and men in rooms deciding where boundaries will lie. Yet in the end, history often depends on whether children have been told to keep their boots by the bed. Agnes counts stores. Joran counts hours of water. Tomas counts ropes and sound. I count who will panic when woken and who will hold silence because silence has already been practiced. The younger ones make a game of it. The older ones ask too many sharp questions, which I prefer. Fear that speaks can still be guided. Fear that hides becomes a hole in the ice. Little Mara asked whether a town can come with us if we leave it behind. I told her a town is not houses. A town is an agreement. She said then, we must remember the agreement. That child will either become a saint or a smuggler. He put the page down with almost tender care. There was something strange about piecing together a vanished place through the minds of its keepers. Each object in Brackenby now seemed to belong equally to the present emptiness and to the memory of the hand that last arranged it. The copybooks no longer felt like evidence alone. They felt like proof of intelligence. He searched the rest of the room. Behind the map on the wall, pinned flat with wax, lay one more paper not meant for open sight. It was a list of household instructions written in teachers' script but using town names. Bakers, wrap bread in cloth, not paper. Mothers, no lullabies after the bell. Older children, each take one small one by hand. No name spoken once the road is entered. At the rise, do not look back. That final line struck him hard. Do not look back. The command was practical, perhaps. Looking back slows feet. Looking back breaks resolve. Looking back tells a person that home remains possible, yet it also read like ritual, like a charm against grief. He folded the sheet and placed it in his satchel. That afternoon they went west for the first time. Brackenby's western road climbed toward the ridge in two long curves, bordered by low stone walls and autumn-thinned hawthorn. If the town had wished to depart in normal fashion, west would have been the easiest direction. The road linked to Den Cross, then to Grenfell, then onward to the kingdom's real arteries. Any flight that wished speed, trade, safety, or witness would choose west. That, Elias now suspected, was why Brackenby had not. Still, he wanted to know what waited there. Near the ridge they found where a cavalry scout or messenger had once paused. The ground held two old horse prints cut deep enough to survive the rain beneath overhanging stone. Beside them lay a scrap of oilcloth and the char of a small watch fire. Not recent enough to matter immediately, but recent enough to belong to the season. Recruiters, Elias asked, or taxmen, or anyone who thinks horses make them important, Mira said. She studied the road. This pass is narrow. 10 men could watch the valley from here and count every cart that leaves. He looked back from the height. Brackenby lay below, tucked into its hollow by river and marsh, not hidden exactly but easy to overlook from a distant map. A place someone might ignore for years and then suddenly desire because a larger need had shifted elsewhere. Grain, men, timber, road rights, safe winter quarters. Kingdoms acquire appetite in clusters. He understood at last why Agnes had written the line that troubled him most: peace can also be a noose. On the ridge wall someone had carved initials into the stone within the last month. BM and TR. Below them a date, 10 Frostwain. Bren Marrow, likely the mayor's nephew, and Tomas Reed the bellringer, perhaps keeping watch, perhaps measuring time, perhaps only resting while pretending the world below could still be preserved by observation. Elias put his hand to the cold carving. You pity them, Mira said. I respect them. Not the same thing. No, he admitted, not the same. They found the watch place used more than once. A niche among gorse shrubs held ashes, one cracked flask, and a wool blanket folded with care. There had been a rota. Men and older boys watching the western road while the schoolmistress taught children how not to appear on a map. No war had yet come to Brackenby, but war's shadow had. On the way back they passed the orchard south of town. Apples lay fallen and split among the grass, sweet smell rising from rot. Crows hopped branch to branch with proprietary calm. Mira stopped by one tree where a child's ribbon had been tied to a low branch. Blue, the same shade as the thread around Agnes's letters. Signal, she asked. Maybe. He checked more trees. At 3 points around the orchard he found ribbons of different colors tied low enough that only those searching for them would notice. Blue at the south, white toward the lane, green at the path leading east. A code. Mira saw the pattern a moment after he did. Direction marks. For the night departure. Or for children, follow this color, not that one. They stood under the trees while the evening cooled. Brackenby's disappearance was no longer a mystery in the crude sense. Not magic, not sudden plague, not raiders from a forgotten border. No. It had been planned by practical people with bread, thread, rope, school lessons, and watch fires. But the deeper mystery remained untouched. Planned toward what? He returned once more to the schoolroom after dark because the gray notebook would not leave him alone. On the final pages he found the closest thing yet to an answer, though it came wrapped in doubt. Agnes insists there is an old abbey road beyond St. Vay where the marsh rises to buried stone. Joran says his grandfather once took sheep east in a dry year and found carved blocks under the moss, enough for wheels if laid with plank. Tomas trusts bells. Agnes trusts memory. I trust repetition. If we succeed, no one will believe a whole town chose inconvenience over obedience. They will invent soldiers, fire, pestilence, miracle, ghosts, seduction, punishment from heaven. People prefer drama to discipline. But discipline is what carries a child through dark ground without crying out. And perhaps that is the truest thing I have learned. Empires move with drums. Small places survive by teaching quiet. He closed the notebook. In the square outside, the night had become almost soft. No bell sounded. No voices rose. Yet for the first time since arriving, Elias felt not only unease but admiration warm against it. The vanished town had not merely fled. It had done something rarer. It had acted together. That made the place less ghostly. It also made the search for where they had gone far more difficult, because a frightened crowd leaves traces. A disciplined one leaves stories for the wrong people and silence for the right ones. Chapter 5. On the fifth morning the weather broke clear at last, and with the clear sky came a kind of ruthless visibility. The marsh shone black and silver. The roofs of Brackenby stood bright under weak sun. Every window that had looked mysterious in rain now looked merely open, and the new plainness somehow made the town sadder. Mystery can be borne for a while. Plain sorrow asks more of a person. Elias turned his attention to Sister Elin, the physician. Her dwelling stood behind the church garden, half house and half herb room, with bunches of dried mint, thyme and feverfew hanging from every beam. Jars lined the shelves in military rows. Mortar and pestle sat clean upon the work table. A kettle remained on its hook with a skin of old water inside. Of all Brackenby's buildings, this one suggested vigilance most strongly. A physician's room never fully sleeps. In the drawer beside the treatment bench he found her case book. Sister Elin wrote in a hand so compressed it seemed almost ashamed of occupying space. The first half of the book was ordinary medicine for a valley town. Coughs, fevers, stitched fingers, one mule bite, births, old lungs failing when frost came, rashes from river weeds, a crushed foot under a mill wheel, sleeplessness in widowers, sleeplessness in women who had not yet become widows but understood probabilities. Then, as with Tomas and Lysa, the season shifted and the entries changed. 22 harvest month. 3 children report hearing bells in sleep. No fever, no ear infection, mothers anxious. Advised less cider before bed. 24 harvest month. Agnes Marrow asks whether mass suggestion can spread through a town. I tell her yes, but so can common sense. She does not laugh. 28 harvest month. Brother Cal complains of headaches and poor rest. Says the eastern marsh hums at night. I suggested he spend less time inventing omens around places he hopes to tax. 2 Frostwane. Joran Pike reports waking before dawn with certainty that someone had called his name from below the ferry landing. Found no one. Claims sound came from water. Strong spirits on breath. Noted but not trusted. 4 Frostwane. 7 separate patients in 3 days mentioned dreams of walking east in darkness while hearing 1 bell behind and 1 ahead. This is now too patterned to dismiss entirely. Cause unknown. Shared worry is my current best answer. Mira, reading over his shoulder, said, shared worry can move men as well as orders. It can move children too, apparently. Children breathe adult fear before adults admit there is any. He nodded. The physician's notes supported a thought that had been turning in him since the schoolhouse. The bells may have begun as sound, or rumor, or a trick of echo in the marsh, but once the town's fear and intention gathered around them, the bells ceased to be merely heard. They became useful. Further in the case book, he found a page that had been folded several times and reopened often enough to weaken the crease. I do not think the bell is wholly real or wholly imagined. This is not as foolish as it sounds. A place under pressure begins to generate symbols. The mind is a good servant to patterns and a poor servant to uncertainty. A bell is useful because it means warning, summons, ritual, order, death, marriage, danger, duty, and time all at once. No wonder the town chose it. If the sound exists physically, Tomas will find it. If it exists socially, Agnes already has. If it exists in the body, I can do nothing except name it. Below that, in smaller writing, almost as if she hoped not to agree with herself, still, I heard it tonight. Elias looked up from the page. He had expected practicality from the physician. He had not expected humility before ambiguity. Do you believe her? Mira asked. I believe she was not eager to believe herself. That is usually worth something. On the herb shelf behind the ledger, Elias found a second notebook. This one was not medical. It held, instead, brief portraits of townspeople, perhaps made by a Lynn for her own understanding. Agnes Marrow carries worry like a bucket balanced on the head, one hand always free. Tomas Raid, frightened by the possibility that meaning may exist where he has not placed it. Lysa Thorne would rather be correct than liked, which has preserved several children already. Joran Pike jokes at the edge of fear until fear forgets which one of them is speaking. Brother Cal, not evil, merely trained to mistake counting for knowledge. He stopped there. There, Mira said softly. Not evil. That surprises you. It disappoints me. Villains simplify paperwork. The note on Brother Cal continued. He suspects something but not enough. Watches the square too closely. Ate little at supper. Avoids the physician's eyes. May yet be turned or at least delayed. Turned. Delayed. Again the pattern returned. Brackenby had not planned for simple flight. It had planned around a witness. They searched the physician's cupboards in hopes of finding more direct evidence and instead discovered the ordinary economy of departure. Bandages rolled and set aside in bundles. Dried willow bark packed into travel pouches. Honey sealed in wax. Needles wrapped in cloth. Medicines portioned for movement. A town leaving home might forget furniture. It would not forget fever remedies. By midday, Elias had filled 12 pages of notes and still did not know where the Abbey Road led. So he went once more to the ferry hut and followed the eastern reeds farther than before, using Joran Pike's missing boat as his next question. The channels beyond the first bank widened into black mirrors divided by hummocks of grass. Twice, he nearly sank above the ankle before Mira pulled him to firmer ground with impolite efficiency. Dragonflies skated low over the water, though the season had cooled. One heron rose ahead of them, annoyed at being disturbed. Then, hidden among the reeds under willow shade, they found the boat. It had been pulled up into a slit of mud and covered with woven reed mats darkened to match the bank. Clever. From 10 paces away, it was no more visible than a patch of collapsed sedge. Inside lay 3 things: a child's mitten, a broken lantern frame with the glass removed, and a scrap of parchment sealed in wax and tucked beneath the bench. Elias broke the seal. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a list. Boat first, infirm, tools, planks, medicine. Then children who sleep hardest. Then grain sacks, no horses unless final. Keep West Bank watchers until bell. He held the parchment in both hands, feeling a dry fascination deepen into awe. The town had staged its departure in waves. First, the boat across the eastern channels to move what the tunnel could not yet bear. Then the passage at St. Vay for those on foot. Watchers on the western ridge until the false morning bell. Disciplined, Mira said again, and mercilessly practical. Mercy is easier after survival. She was right. He hated that too. They poled the hidden boat across one narrow channel and came to a low spit of ground on the east side where willow roots knotted through old stone just beneath the mud. Elias knelt and scraped with his knife. Carved blocks emerged, square and worked, their edges too clean for nature. The Abbey Road, or part of it. It ran under the marsh like a memory too stubborn to rot. He looked east from there and saw, for the first time, the faint rise of darker land beyond the reeds. Not far. A half-mile perhaps. Enough to hide a camp. Enough to hide 200 people for one night before moving on. Beyond that, the land rose again into alder woods and a line of broken hills omitted from most state surveys because nothing taxable had ever been found there. Nothing taxable. He thought of Agnes smiling grimly over that omission. On the return they heard the bell in broad daylight. No mist, no sleep, no wine. A single note low and far from somewhere east of the Reed Sea. Both of them stopped. Mira's hand went to her sword by habit before she seemed almost embarrassed by the reflex. That was real. Yes. Not imagination, not metaphor. Real. Elias listened for the echo and caught none. The sound had depth but not spread, as if struck within stone or under cover. One note only, then nothing. Could water carry it, he asked. From where? An old abbey, a buried chapel, a cave, or someone with a bell who wishes to be heard precisely once. They stood a while, neither willing to cheapen the thing by pretending it had not mattered. When they returned to Brackenby, Elias searched the inn again for anything connected to Brother Cal. In the upstairs room where the ledger said the collector had slept, he found beneath the mattress a leather wallet containing 2 church receipts, 1 set of travel permits, and a letter begun in hurried script. To Father Marin at Grenfell, the town of Brackenby is not rebellious in the common way, but altered. They speak politely and answer selectively. The widow Marrow governs too firmly for my liking and has the villagers in some kind of mutual understanding from which I am excluded. The schoolmistress teaches odd lessons. The ferryman lies with the serene face of a man who thinks lying locally is not sinful if done against outsiders. There are reports among them of a bell east of town, which I judged superstition until last night, when I too heard it from the marsh. This may be nothing, though I confess it has unsettled me more than I care to state. If I do not send the grain counts by next week, assume delay rather than defiance. I believe they are preparing for something, though whether festival, panic, or concealment I cannot yet say. The letter ended there. No signature, no final line, no evidence it had ever been sent. Mira read it in silence. He knew. He suspected. And still he stayed. Elias thought of Alin's note, may yet be turned, or at least delayed. Perhaps they had tried to persuade him. Perhaps they had watched him. Perhaps they had fed him enough cider to slow his judgment. Perhaps he had been frightened by the bell in a way that made him hesitate too long. In ordinary histories, witnesses matter because they speak. In this one, a witness mattered because he had almost spoken and failed. Twilight settled. The town drew its empty shape around them once more. Elias carried the case book back to the inn and sat by the window where the lantern light could not be seen from outside. He turned to the physician's final entries. 11 Frostwain. Agnes asked what to do for grief after the road is chosen. I told her grief will travel whether invited or not. 11 Frostwain later. Treated Tomas for rope burn where he tested the tower hammer device. Treated Joran for pride after he slipped from the east plank path in front of 2 children. 12 Frostwain. It is one thing to diagnose a town, another to love it enough to help it become unfindable. 14 Frostwain. If I am ever asked whether I believed in the bell, I will say I believed in what it allowed frightened people to become. That night Elias did not sleep for a long while. He sat listening, not for ghosts, not for miracle, not even for the bell, but for the movement of a disciplined plan taking shape in his mind. Brackenby had not waited to be crushed. It had studied itself first. And in studying itself, it had discovered the one route history rarely expects from small places, not resistance in the open, but disappearance on purpose. Chapter 6. On the sixth day, they decided to go beyond the flooded turn at St. Vay. It was a foolish decision in the practical sense, which meant it was probably the correct one. Elias had gathered enough papers to satisfy any office in the capital that only wanted a report. Brackenby, he could now say with confidence, had not been burned, raided, or pestilenced. Its people had organized a departure east through marsh and old stone. There had been no battle. There had been intention. But intention still leaves a trail, and he wanted the rest of it. Mira prepared for the tunnel as she would for a small campaign. Rope, covered lamp, waxed packets of tinder, spare shirt, knife, iron pittons, a coil of cloth to wrap boots against splashing stone. Elias brought a map case, graphite, the sketch from Tomas's journal, and enough stubbornness to equal any professional tool. At St. Vay, the morning mist sat low around the ruin, muting distance. The broken arch seemed to emerge from whiteness and return to it. Crows watched from the wall but did not complain. The tunnel steps breathed cold as before. This time they entered with planks. Beyond the flooded section, the passage bent left and narrowed. Mira set the first plank into the black water while Elias held the lamp high. Together they crossed the drowned stretch slowly, one boot length at a time, balancing like poor acrobats with much to lose. The ceiling lowered. Twice Elias struck his shoulder on stone. The water smelled older than marsh water, more mineral, less alive, as if it had been trapped under earth long enough to forget reeds and fish. Past the flood chamber the tunnel rose again. There, at last, the old road revealed itself properly. Stone paving, worn grooves, side niches where lamps might once have stood. In one wall, half buried by silt, a carved relief of a bell flanked by vines. Not Christian work. Older. Perhaps monastic, built on Roman foundations, or Roman repaired by monks, or any of the other layered histories by which Europe makes everything more inconvenient to date than a clerk would like. Elias crouched to touch the carving. Its mouth was chipped, its handle worn smooth. Many hands had passed here in times when Brackenby was not yet even a rumor. An abbey road, he murmured. Mira looked ahead. And recently used. Indeed it had. Mud on the stone held dozens of prints hardened, then softened again by damp. There were cart drags in places, not full wheels but sled marks, as if heavy things had been pulled where wheels could not pass. At one niche lay a child's button. At another, a tuft of sheep wool caught on rough mortar. The tunnel had carried a community. They went on. Every 50 paces Elias marked the route in his field book, measuring turns, slope, and wall condition with the hungry precision of his trade. He felt almost ashamed of it. Here was a road designed precisely to avoid measure, and he was measuring it anyway. Yet perhaps that was the curse of his kind. To map is to love and betray simultaneously. The passage opened after a quarter mile into an underground chamber vast enough to swallow the Brackenby in. He stopped so sharply, Mira nearly walked into him. The roof lifted above them into darkness where their lamp could not reach. Columns, if they were columns, stood like tree trunks in blackness. Water dripped from somewhere high. The floor had once been tiled and now lay mostly broken beneath centuries of silt. Along one wall ran stone benches. Along another, alcoves large enough for storage or prayer. An abbey crypt, a subterranean hall, a Roman cistern rededicated by later hands. At the chamber's center hung a bell, not large, not grand, bronze darkened green and brown by time, suspended from an oak beam braced between two pillars. The rope had rotted long ago, but a newer cord had been tied to the clapper with practical knots. Elias stared. So did Mira. For several moments the world narrowed to the existence of that object and the absurd simplicity with which it resolved half the town's mystery while deepening the other half. "There," Mira said at last. "Yes. So the bell was real. It was. And someone used it." He stepped closer. The bell was ancient but sound. On its shoulder ran an inscription in a language he could not fully read, though later hands had scratched simpler marks over it: cross signs, initials, dates, one carved fish, one vulgar drawing probably added by some novice 200 years ago. More recent than all of these, cut carefully into the beam from which it hung, were the words, "When struck once, gather. When struck twice, do not light." Instructions, Mira said, for those who knew them. The chamber held more evidence of recent passage: ashes from shielded fires, a stack of reed mats, 3 barrels, empty now but smelling of grain, fragments of cloth, a child's sleeping pallet made from old sail and packed rush. Sister Elin's kind of medicine packet, trampled underfoot. The town had not merely passed through, it had assembled here. He imagined the hall in darkness lit by hooded lamps, families pressed close, carts unloaded, children hushed, Tomas or Agnes or Joran standing beneath the bell while water dripped and old stone listened. Brackenby had come under the earth before vanishing from it. At the far end of the chamber 3 passages branched. One had collapsed. One ran south and down into complete darkness with an air so stale Mira dismissed it instantly. The third ran east and upward. They took the upward one. The slope lengthened, then opened at last into daylight through a split in the hillside choked with alder roots. They emerged on the far side of the marsh onto ground no survey map in Elias's satchel bothered to name. The Eastland was not dramatic. That was the first thing he noticed. No hidden kingdom, no miracle valley, only rough pasture broken by old walls, alder thickets, and a long abandoned road ridge showing beneath grass like the bones of something once useful. Yet for people wishing not to be counted, it was perfect. The land folded into itself. Smoke from a small fire would vanish among the trees. Tracks would break on stone. Any rider from the west would first have to guess that there was something here worth riding toward. Mira scanned the ground. "Camp," she pointed. Signs lay everywhere once he learned the scale, not the chaos of permanent settlement, the tidiness of an overnighting multitude. Ash circles extinguished well. Peg holes where wagons had been covered. Latrine trenches filled carefully. Straw flattened in long rows. One place where someone had tethered 2 goats. Another where children had sat around something and scraped designs into the dirt with sticks before rain softened them. They moved farther east and found the marks of onward travel. At least 6 carts, many feet, a few animals at the rear, and all of it headed not south toward towns, not west toward roads, but northeast into the broken hills. Elias climbed a low rise and saw, through thinning branches, the ruins of stone walls stretching along the slope beyond. Not buildings, terraces perhaps, or old cloister farms connected to the Abbey Road, the dead infrastructure of forgotten institutions. He understood then the genius of the choice. Brackenby had not fled into wilderness, it had fled into neglect. Into land once organized enough to sustain movement, long enough ignored that no living power cared to police it. He sat on the rise and opened his field book. Mira stood watch while he sketched the chamber, the bell, the exit, the old terraces, the direction of travel. His fingers moved automatically. His mind did not. Something in him had shifted since entering the underground hall. The bell had made the town's story easier to tell, but harder to judge. There is comfort in believing people vanish through disaster. Disaster absolves everyone except fate. Brackenby offered no such ease. Its people had looked at the future being built for them and chosen erasure over compliance. No office would like that explanation. They followed the northeast trail for another hour until the marks crossed stony ground and thinned. There, beneath a standing stone mottled with lichen, Elias found a marker placed intentionally at ankle height, 3 white pebbles stacked inside a ring of twigs. A traveler's sign, or a signal. Mira scanned the hill lines, not random. No. He searched nearby and found, hidden in the hollow of the stone, a twist of waxed cloth containing 1 folded page. This page held no letter, only names. 47 household heads listed in Agnes's hand. Beside each, a single small mark, present, every household, no names missing. At the bottom, in firmer stroke than the rest, the town crossed. No one left behind. Elias closed his eyes briefly. All this time he had assumed there had been losses, stragglers, secrets, dissenters, perhaps a body hidden somewhere shamefully. But the list said otherwise. If Agnes wrote truth, Brackenby had accomplished the impossible in full. An entire town had crossed the marsh road and reached the Eastland together. Mira took the page and read it. For the first time since he had known her, he saw something very much like respect deepen into reverence. "Well," she said softly, "that is a harder thing than winning some battles I have seen." He could not disagree. The afternoon waned. They had to decide whether to follow the northeast trail farther and risk being caught outside the tunnel after dark, or return to Brackenby with what they had. Mira argued for return. Elias agreed, though reluctantly. Knowledge tempts greedily when one nears its edges. Before they went back, they searched the terraces. Among the broken walls, they found evidence of a second halt, more recent ash, split sacks, a mule shoe. A child's slate on which someone had drawn, with charming seriousness, a row of houses under a hill and then crossed the houses out one by one. On the reverse side of the slate were 6 words. "A town can walk if people do." He set the slate down carefully. The return through the underground chamber felt different now, less haunted, more inhabited by the idea of what had passed there. Elias looked again at the bell before leaving. Without asking why, he touched the newer cord and gave the gentlest pull. The bell answered with 1 low note that spread through stone like water through ink. Not loud, not alarming, just deep enough to gather memory. The sound moved through the chamber, up the passage, and into the body in a way that no church bell above ground ever had. He understood at once why frightened townspeople would remember it in their sleep. It was not merely heard, it was felt in the ribs. Mira looked at him sharply when the note faded. Necessary. Yes. Why? He thought a moment. Because I needed to know whether it sounded like fear. And it sounded like decision. They emerged from St. Vay at dusk. The marsh had turned rose-gray under the evening. Brackenby waited beyond it, patient and empty. As they walked back, Elias became aware of another question growing larger than all the rest. If he wrote the full truth, what then? The Crown would know the route. The Office of Roads and Measures would map the Eastland. The neglected hills would become countable. The Abbey Road would pass from memory into administration. Brackenby, which had labored so carefully to become unfindable, might simply be found by the wrong profession. By his profession. Night came quietly around the town. He did not yet say the thought aloud, but the bell's note went with him into the dark like an answer waiting for a braver question. Chapter 7, After the Tunnel, Brackenby ceased being a puzzle and became a burden. Elias felt it in the way he touched his satchel, now heavy with notebooks, letters, maps, and proofs. A mapmaker lives by producing legible truths for people in power. Yet what he carried was the sort of truth that might betray precisely those who deserved to keep it. He said none of this to Mira that evening. They ate in tired silence at the inn with cold bread, cheese from the mayor's pantry, and cider that had begun to turn. The square outside darkened. 1 window shutter somewhere tapped gently in the wind, then stopped. At last Mira said, "You are deciding what sort of man you become in the report." He looked up. That obvious. To anyone not in love with paper. He almost denied the charge, then gave it up. "If I conceal the route, I fail the office. If you reveal it, you fail the town." "Yes." Then there is your clean choice. There is nothing clean in that. She took a drink of the sour cider and made a face as honest as a child's. No, but there is clarity. Clarity did not bring comfort. Unable to sit still, he went upstairs and searched Brother Cal's room more thoroughly than before. This time he emptied the travel trunk, shook the blankets, checked the hollow under the washstand, and finally pried loose one floorboard beneath the bed where a loose nail had caught his eye. Inside the cavity lay a wrapped packet sealed with church wax. Not sent. Not hidden well enough for a determined search, but well enough for a guest assuming he had one more night. The packet contained 2 documents. The first was Brother Cal's completed report, addressed to Grenfall. To Father Marin and by copy to the Office of District Tithes, I advise immediate attention to the valley town of Brackenby. The place is small but better provisioned than prior rolls indicate, suggesting underreporting. Local governance under Widow Agnes Marrow is unusually consolidated. Villagers display collective evasiveness. They have likely concealed grain and possibly livestock beyond the declared count. Rumors of a bell in the eastern marsh are serving either as superstition or signal. I request 2 men with me on my return and authority to inspect storehouses, ferry access, and the old St. Vay ground. So there it was. He had intended to expose them. The second document was stranger, a private confession, unsigned but clearly in Cal's hand, written after the official report and more hurriedly. I do not like the widow's eyes. She looks at me as one looks at weather, without hatred but with preparation. The schoolmistress dislikes me honestly, which is easier to bear. The physician sees more than I say. The ferryman lies badly on purpose to insult me. I believe they mean to move the town or some portion of it, yet I cannot understand how. There is no adequate road east and west. They remain observable. If they try flight by marsh, they are mad. If they stay, they will be inspected. Perhaps they hope only to hide stores and play peasant games with authorities who have seen such tricks before. And yet the children no longer write the town's name. That line again. He read on. I heard the bell tonight from beneath the floor or beyond the wall or from the marsh itself, and for one ridiculous moment I felt that I was the only man in Brackenby who had already become a ghost. If I leave at dawn, they will think I know too much. If I stay, they will ensure I know too little. This is the first parish duty of my life that has made me envy deserters. Elias lowered the paper. Cal had been neither villain nor fool. He had been trapped between institution and intuition, which often kills a man's certainty faster than either enemy or age. Mira read the documents and gave the verdict he expected. He would have brought them down on Brackenby. Yes, and he knew it. Yes. What became of him? That question had hovered at the edge of everything. Brother Cal was not on Agnes's household list. His name had been crossed out. No body had been found. No horse or clear departure west had been traced. If the town crossed together, where had the collector gone? The answer came the next morning in the church tower. Elias had climbed there hoping to understand Tomas Reed's hammer device more fully. The tower was narrow, its stairs worn hollow by centuries of bells, funerals, and cold-footed dawns. At the top he found the bell mechanism rigged exactly as the journal described, a line of weighted cord run through pulleys to a pegged release. Tomas had fixed it so that when pull on a lower latch, delayed by a water drip from a jug suspended over a spoon, would ring the bell at dawn after the tower was empty. Clever, quiet, rural genius. He admired it for half a moment. Then he noticed the beam above the stairs. Scratched into the wood, not deeply but with frantic force, were several lines of text. Elias held the lamp closer. I was told to wait until first light. They said no harm if I stayed quiet. I stayed. They rang the bell and were gone. Below that, fainter, I do not think they meant to leave me, but they left me. Then after a space, one final sentence. I hear the other bell still. Brother Cal had hidden in the tower while Brackenby departed, not captured, not murdered, left behind by fear, caution, miscalculation, or perhaps his own choice. Mira climbed up behind him and read over his shoulder. So he stayed, and after dawn, Elias looked out over the square. He would have come down to an empty town. And then he thought of the hidden boat, the eastern marsh, the reports unsent under the floorboard. He may have pursued, or fled, or gone to Grenfall and lost courage, or followed the bell. Which means we still do not know. No. They searched the tower base and found one more trace, a crust of dried mud by the lower door, distinct from the town's older tracks. The mud contained fine black silt like the eastern channels, not the western road. Cal had gone east after being left. Whether by desperation, curiosity, or fury, they could not tell. That possibility changed the tone of everything. Perhaps the collector had discovered the tunnel too late and followed in poor light. Perhaps he had heard the underground bell and mistaken it for invitation or warning. Perhaps he had even reached the Eastland and seen what no report should have seen. Past noon, Elias returned to Agnes's letters for anything concerning him, and found, in one of the final unsent pages, a brief exchange she had recorded almost like a dialogue. Brother Cal asked me this evening why the children write home instead of Brackenby on their maps. I told him because a wise child knows that one can be stolen more easily than the other. He said the crown does not steal towns. I asked whether the crown first asks permission before renaming roads. Later he asked whether I meant rebellion. I said no. He seemed relieved, which told me he still thinks rebellion is the only thing authorities fear. Elias smiled grimly. Agnes understood statecraft better than half the state. The rest of the day he spent reconstructing the final 3 nights before departure. He laid notes across the inn tables until the common room resembled a scholar's battlefield. Night 1, Western watch increased after sighting riders near Den Cross. Night 2, Cal hears bell, grows suspicious, writes report. Night 3, meeting at bakehouse, final consent list marked, stores portion, children instructed. Departure night, boat first with infirm, tools, planks, medicine. Then the tunnel assembly. Then dawn bell from empty tower. Then east crossing complete. He searched for a date anchor and found one in the baker's account slate. 24 loaves prepared for road night. That phrase, simple as it was, made his chest tighten. Road night. As though the town had already made departure into a thing speakable among themselves. Mira studied the arrangement of papers. How do you know they all truly wanted it? I do not know. But Agnes counted readiness. Lysa trained the unwilling into usefulness. Elin packed for grief. That is the most honest version of collective choice I have ever seen. She nodded. In armies, willingness is overrated. Cohesion matters more. He looked at her. That is a bleak principle. It is also why armies function and villages sometimes do not. Your vanished town had both. Toward evening, they made one final circuit of Brackenby, not searching now so much as saying farewell to a place they had never properly known alive. The baker's yard glowed amber in late light. The school windows reflected the sky. The mayor's ash trees dropped yellow leaves over the square. One leaf landed on the market stone and stayed there, bright as sealing wax. At the orchard, Mira asked a question he had half dreaded. If the town is not far, do you want to find it? He stopped under the apple boughs. The honest answer rose before the prudent one could speak. Yes, because I want to know what became of them. And after you know. He looked east toward the marsh, now turning gold at its edges. I do not know. Then be careful. Men often call curiosity innocent when it is only appetite dressed more politely. That might have been the wisest thing anyone had said to him all week. Night came. Still no further bell. Yet Brackenby no longer felt empty in the same fashion. The town had become crowded with decisions. Every room contained one. Every object testified to one. The place was more inhabited by intention in absence than many towns ever are in full population. Before sleep, Elias opened Brother Cal's private confession once more and read the line that troubled him most. "This is the first parish duty of my life that has made me envy deserters." He wondered whether the collector, once left in an empty square with the false dawn bell finished ringing, had stood exactly where Elias had stood days later and understood the scale of what had happened. Not rebellion. Not miracle. Something subtler and perhaps more frightening to authority. A town had discovered that the smallest form of power is deciding whether to remain available, and once discovered, that idea does not stay politely in one valley. It travels. Chapter 8. On the seventh day, Elias crossed the marsh again, but this time not as investigator alone. He crossed as a listener to traces. The distinction mattered. They left before dawn, carrying only what they could not bear to lose: Agnes's letters, Tomas's journal, Lisa's notebook, Elin's case book, Brother Cal's unsent report, a coil of line from the tower, and enough bread for the day. Elias had decided he would walk the northeast trail as far as daylight allowed, and while walking it, try to place every found object back into the human sequence from which it had fallen. A story, he had learned, is often the only faithful map for things that move together. The bell chamber waited under St. Vay with its damp patience. When they reached it, he paused beneath the hanging bronze and listened to the drops from the vaulted roof. Then he began to imagine the night, not fancifully, not as a poet, as a man assembling motion from clues. He pictured Agnes Marrow first, because every paper in Brackenby bent toward her gravity. She would not have stood theatrically in the center making speeches. Women who actually move towns do not waste time on postures fit for paintings. She would have been near the edge, counting heads, checking bundles, deciding who passed first through the rising tunnel and who waited. Her coat would have smelled of rain and flour because she had likely come from the bakehouse meeting with bread still warm. Her voice would have stayed low. Her eyes, Brother Cal said, looked like weather. On road night that would have helped. He imagined Tomas Reed at the bell beam with rope-burned palms, listening for any echo from the western watch. Perhaps he touched the ancient bell once without striking it, like a nervous man touching a horse before a difficult ride. He imagined Lisa Thorne kneeling to children's height, assigning hands, you with her, you behind your brother, no names from now on, count breaths if you become afraid. He imagined Elin checking the infirm by lamp hood, wrap that cough, drink now not later, yes you may cry once we are moving, no you are not dying, you are only leaving. Joran Pike would have made jokes because such men always do. He would joke while balancing sacks into the hidden boat. He would joke while slipping in mud. He would joke because every town requires one person willing to make dignity slightly cheaper, so courage becomes affordable. Elias walked through the chamber slowly as he thought all this, and each relic supported the vision rather than mocked it. Here the rush pallet where children might have been laid in rows. Here the barrel station where grain and tools were stacked. Here the wall niche from which someone took the newer bell cord. Here the place where a lamp had smoked, leaving soot like a thumbprint above head height. At the east exit he found something he had missed before. Carved low into the stone, hidden by alder roots and only visible in slant light, were two lines in small writing. Wait for the old and the slow. A town that runs is no town at all. Agnes, again. Or perhaps Lisa. The handwriting was too rough in stone to know. They followed the northeast trail. The old terraces climbed in long steps along the hill. At their tops stood the roofless remains of outbuildings attached once, perhaps, to the abbey's eastern farms. Enough stone remained to shelter wind but not weather. In one such ruin they found the black trace of a larger campfire and the heel marks of many people who had stood in a half-circle. Elias imagined dawn there. The town, having crossed the marsh, gathered on the neglected slope while the false bell rang behind them from empty Brackenby. The sound would arrive thin and familiar over distance, turning every face west for one involuntary moment. Then Agnes's command from the schoolroom instruction returned to him. At the rise, do not look back. Perhaps some obeyed and some failed. How many times in history has survival depended on the direction of a single glance? He found another relic in the ruin, a child's slate broken cleanly in two. One half was blank. On the other, in cramped letters, someone had written a question. If we leave the graves, who remembers them? No answer followed. That question carried him forward all afternoon. Memory had been one of the town's real burdens. Not just grain and medicine, not just children and planks, but memory. A people may choose departure quickly if they hate a place. Brackenby had not hated itself. It had loved itself enough to leave the structures behind and take the agreement forward. That is harder. That is why maps struggle with it. Maps understand buildings better than loyalties. Near a spring cut into the hillside, they found a cloth packet tucked under stone. Within it lay three things preserved dry: a comb, a small brass church key, and half a letter in Tomas Reed's hand. If we ring no more after today, perhaps that is mercy. I have always thought bells belong to places, but Alin says they belong to the bodies that answer them. If so, then maybe a bell can travel even when metal stays behind. I do not know whether that comforts me. The rest of the page had been torn away. Mira read it twice. He grew wiser under pressure, or more confused. Wisdom and confusion often sleep in the same bed. By late afternoon, the northeast trail entered alder woods where the ground hardened and the marks thinned. Here Brackenby's discipline became almost infuriating in its success. Wheels had been brushed, ashes scattered, branches bent back. Where the path forked, false traces led south into stonier ground. Children trained on Lysa's hidden lessons had likely helped. A child who knows how to erase a name from a map can learn to step on stone. Still, fragments remained. A knot of blue thread on a bush at shoulder height. An apple core gnawed to the seeds. The imprint of a crutch tip. One place where someone had rested a heavy chest long enough to compress moss into a neat rectangle. He reconstructed the moving order from such marks, stronger adults at the front laying direction, children and infirm central, carts staggered, watchmen rearward. This had not been a wandering. It had been migration under local command. As the light lowered, he imagined the scene more fully, and for a little while the chapter of evidence turned almost into witness within him. He saw Brackenby on road night as though standing among them. No stars because cloud lay thick over the valley. Only hooded lamps, each no brighter than a cupped hand. The smell of wet wool, cold bread, lamp fat and mud. A baby beginning to cry and being soothed into the mother's coat before the sound grew. Tomas at the chamber bell listening, not striking. Brother Kel not present because he had chosen the tower or had been maneuvered there. Agnes taking the final household marks: Marrow present, Pike present, Fen present, Dace present, Thorn present, Reed present, Alin present, all the way through the list until the town no longer existed as houses but as names answering in the dark. Perhaps that was the moment Brackenby actually vanished, not when the square became empty at dawn, not when the school map lost its label. But there, underground, when the roll of households answered from beneath St. Vay and the community shifted from place to procession. He nearly said this aloud, but Mira was walking ahead, and the woods had become too quiet for speech. They halted at a ridge where the trail dissolved into sheep paths and old wall lines. From there the land sloped down into a broad hidden vale threaded by a narrow stream. On the far side smoke rose, very faint, not enough to show a settlement with certainty, enough to show cooking or brush burning or one shepherd careless with wind. Elias lowered himself behind a wall. Mira crouched instantly beside him. You saw it? Yes. Too far to know. Yes, they watched. The smoke thinned and shifted. No voices, no dogs. No movement visible at that distance except one brief flicker that might have been light on glass or metal. It could have been Brackenby. It could have been no one. The historian in him ached to go nearer. The wiser part remembered Mira's earlier question, and after he stayed where he was. Dusk came blue through the woods. At length Mira said, "If they are there, they deserve warning before being found." "You mean if I march down openly?" "I mean if strangers appear on a ridge watching smoke, the strangers may learn less than they hoped." He smiled without humor. "You think I would be shot?" "I think disciplined people who move to town without leaving bodies are not sentimental fools." That ended the matter. They turned back before dark claimed the paths. On the return through the abbey chamber, Elias paused beneath the bell again and this time did not touch it. Instead, he set Agnes's household list against one column and copied the names carefully into his own book, then closed the original and replaced it in its cloth. Why copy and not keep? Because some records should continue belonging first to those who made them. When they emerged from St. Vay, night had fully fallen. The stars were visible at last, sharp over the marsh. Brackenby lay ahead with its windows blind. At the inn, Elias wrote long after Mira slept. He wrote not only facts but the shape of the departure as he now understood it. He wrote of the children taking hands, of the medicines portioned, of the watch on the western ridge, of the bell hung underground, of the slate asking who remembers the graves. He wrote until the pen cramped his fingers. Then he stopped and stared at the page. One sentence stood there, more personal than anything he had intended to write in an official journal. A town did not vanish here. A town translated itself. He read it twice. It was not proper language for an office. It was, however, true in the deepest way he knew. Before sleeping, he added one more note: "If I ever speak of Brackenby as abandoned, let it be known I lacked courage that day." The lamp burned low. Somewhere in the valley an owl called once. And in the chamber under St. Vay, whether heard or only remembered, he thought he felt the bell continuing its one patient note through stone and body alike. Less a warning now than a promise that places made by agreement do not end when their roofs are left to weather. Chapter 9. The 8th morning brought visitors. Elias heard the horses before he saw them, 3 of them on the western road, coming down the ridge at an official pace that managed to sound both urgent and self-important. He and Mira were in the square. She looked once toward the road and then toward him with an expression that meant the week had stopped being private. The riders entered Brackenby under the stale authority of district colors. One was a clerk in a weather-spotted blue coat, young enough to treat paperwork as moral force. One was a parish man in black with tired eyes and mud to the knees. The third was an older trooper carrying himself like someone who had spent half his life escorting men whose hands remained soft by design. The clerk introduced himself first, because clerks often think names are weapons. Darren Wess, District Records, sent from Grenfell after no return from Brother Cal and no report from the Office of Roads and Measures. He looked around the square and swallowed once, hard enough for Elias to hear. The emptiness of Brackenby did that to people. The parish man removed his hat. Father Marin. So this was the intended recipient of Cal's report. His face had the exhausted kindness of a man who had spent too long hearing confessions and discovering that sin was usually bureaucratic by the time it reached him. The trooper gave only Sergeant Pell. Mira named herself and Elias in return, adding the office titles with enough dryness to make it clear she did not worship any of them. Darren Wess wasted little time. What happened here? Elias had prepared many possible answers during sleepless hours. None felt good in his mouth. Brackenby was not attacked, he said. No evidence of battle, plague, or fire. The people departed in organized fashion. Departed where? That remains uncertain, not a lie. Not fully, the clerk frowned. A whole town does not simply depart into uncertainty. Father Marin looked around the square and said quietly, Apparently it does. Wes disliked that. The young always prefer the world to be smaller when frightened. They spent the morning examining what Elias chose to show them. He led them through the houses, the inn, the church, the schoolhouse with its scraped map name. He produced selected letters from Agnes and notes from Tomas and Alin, enough to demonstrate intention without revealing route. He did not mention the hidden boat. He did not mention the east exit beyond the abbey chamber. He described St. Vay as a partial refuge the townspeople may have used, then stressed the flood and collapse. All of this was technically true. Wes took notes rapidly and badly. Father Marin read Brother Cal's unsent official report with a face that closed rather than opened. When he finished, he said, "Poor man." "Poor town," Mira replied. He met her look and inclined his head once. Agreement, perhaps. At noon, they sat in the inn and discussed what district response might follow. Wes wanted immediate wider search parties, a review of all valley registers, inquiries at neighboring villages, possible seizure of Brackenby stores for safeguarding, and a formal notice of unlawful concealment if the people were found. Unlawful concealment, Elias repeated. Yes, Wes said, if they absconded from tithe, labor count, or military inspection. Father Marin closed his eyes briefly as though praying for patience and finding none. Darren, the clerk flushed but persisted. They cannot simply erase themselves. What example does that set? There it was. Not concern for safety, not mourning. Example. Mira leaned back in her chair with dangerous calm. The example seems to be that small people dislike becoming inventory. Wes turned to her, scandalized. You speak as if this were admirable. No, she said. I speak as if it were understandable. Different category. Elias said nothing. Silence was becoming a form of decision. That afternoon they went to St. Vay together. This was the hardest test yet. Elias led them to the tunnel steps, and through the first flooded turn, enough to satisfy curiosity. Wes, whose boots were made for offices pretending at roads, nearly slipped twice and began complaining about state of access, as if ancient abbey passages owed him maintenance. Father Marin moved more quietly. When they reached the great chamber and the bell hanging there, he stopped dead. He made the sign of the cross. So, he said softly, Cal was not raving. No, Elias answered. Father Marin stepped closer to the bell but did not touch it. His eyes traveled the old inscriptions, the newer beam instructions, the trampled ash. This place has been used recently by many people. Yes. Wes looked around with a kind of horrified administrative fascination. Then they assembled here. How many? At least the whole town. How did they go farther? The eastern way rises, but a collapse and the marsh likely broke their path. Elias kept his voice even. Beyond that, tracks were poor. Again, not wholly false. The falsehood lay in proportion, not fact. Mira stood beside him and added nothing, which was a form of loyalty he would not forget. Father Marin turned from the bell. If they are alive, then they believed this preferable. Wes snapped. Preferable to what? Tax, census, parish correction. Father Marin gave him such a look that the chamber itself seemed to fall quiet around it. Preferable to being governed without ever once being asked what governance had become. Even Wes did not answer that. On the way back through the marsh, Elias thought he saw on the east bank a shape among reeds that moved against the wind. A person, perhaps, watching. When he looked again, it was gone. That evening, once the district men settled uneasily into separate rooms at the inn, Mira found him in the mayor's study. You nearly told them, she said. I nearly told the priest. The priest is attached to the clerk by chain, whether either likes it. He sat in Agnes's chair and looked at her letters spread before him. Am I doing justice or only vanity dressed as conscience? Mira considered. You are deciding who gets to use what you found. That is always power, never purity. He laughed once with no joy. You really were built to comfort historians. I was built to survive officers. It overlaps. Late that night, Father Marin came to speak with him alone. He closed the study door behind him and stood for a while without removing his gloves, as if the decision to speak plainly required physical effort. "Did you find Brother Cal?" he asked. "Not him," Elias said. "Only his words. The parish office will write him as lost in the course of duty if no body appears." Marin's voice was tired, but not evasive. He was earnest, too earnest for a valley like this. Elias hesitated, then showed him the tower beam text about being left behind and hearing the other bell still. He had copied it earlier, precisely for this moment or one like it. Father Marin read it silently. "He stayed," he murmured. "God help him." "You knew him. 3 years. He loved order because he feared moral drift. Men of that kind often mistake categories for virtues. Still, he meant to serve. He also meant to expose the town." "Yes." Marin folded the copy and gave it back. "Those things can both be true." Elias looked at him sharply. The priest met the look without flinching. After a moment, Marin said, "I was not sent only because of Cal." Grenfall heard talk that perhaps the town had done something not merely unlawful but contagious. That word again. "You heard it too?" "Yes." Father Marin moved to the window and looked out toward the square. "If a village can disappear by common consent, other villages may imagine they are capable of decisions never before offered to them. Administrators dislike imagination in the governed. So do some priests." He smiled faintly. "Some priests dislike any competition at all." There was honesty in him. Elias respected that. After a long pause, Marin said very quietly, "If you know where they went, do not tell Dar and Wes." The room seemed to hold still. Elias asked, "And you?" "I am too old to chase people who took their dead with them in memory and their children by the hand. Whatever debt Brackenby owes heaven, heaven has longer roads than district tithes." Then he added, "Write what keeps blood from following paper." He left without waiting for reply. Elias sat alone for a long time after that. The next morning, Wes pressed him for a finalized route summary. Elias gave him one. It was careful, dry, and strategically incomplete. "Brackenby appears to have evacuated under local coordination during the week prior to our arrival. Preparatory instruction is evidenced by school materials, medical provisions, hidden stores, and mechanical delay of the town bell. The assembly point was likely the substructure beneath the ruined St. Vay Chapel east of town. From there, the population proceeded into marsh channels and old collapsed works, after which the trail becomes uncertain and unsafe. Flooding, stone failure, and lack of a continuous modern road make successful large pursuit unlikely without disproportionate cost. Recommend recording the town as dispersed due to anticipated district pressure, harvest insecurity, and local panic amplified by unusual acoustic phenomena associated with the eastern ruins." Mira read it once and snorted. "That is the most elegant lie I have seen this year. It is mostly true." "That is what makes it elegant." Wes, however, was dissatisfied. "This is thin." "It is accurate," Elias said. "It does not say where they are. No, it says pursuit is unlikely to succeed. Also true. It makes district authority sound excessive." "Does it?" Father Marin intervened before the clerk could explode. "Take the report, Darren." Wes did, though with the offended air of a man storing grievance for later use. By noon, the riders left Brackenby westward again, carrying Elias's report, Wes's notes, and the priest's silence. When they were gone, the town felt different once more, not because it had become less empty, but because danger had come close and passed by the skin of language. Mira watched the western road until the riders vanished over the ridge. "You have bought them time." "How much?" She shrugged. "In my experience, time is the only currency no office ever values correctly." He looked east toward the marsh. Somewhere beyond it might lie a veil with thin smoke. Somewhere beyond that, perhaps, Brackenby was becoming something else under another name, or no name at all. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to hope that the town might remain ahead of history a little while longer. Chapter 10. Elias and Mira remained in Brackenby 2 more days after the riders departed. Officially, they were completing the inventory of structures left behind. Unofficially, Elias could not yet bring himself to leave. Some places release a person easily. Others hold him until he has understood not their facts but their terms. Brackenby's terms were simple and severe. A town is not walls. A map is not loyalty. Peace can also be a noose. A bell can be warning, memory, and permission. On the 9th day he went alone to the eastern ridge above the alder vale where they had seen the thread of smoke. He did not go to approach. He went to witness without trespass, if such a thing can ever truly be done. The morning was pale and cold. Frost silvered the grass in shaded hollows. As he crossed the chamber of St. Vay, the ancient bell hung still over him, mute now and perfectly sufficient in silence. Beyond the east exit, the hills opened under a thin sun. He took the same hidden path as before and reached the ridge by noon. This time the smoke was clearer. Not one thread but several, rising low and disciplined among the folds of the far ground. He saw no roofs, only brief angular lines where light struck something man-made between trees. Canvas perhaps, new-cut planks, a wagon side. Once, unmistakably, he saw a child run between 2 pale shapes and disappear. Brackenby, or whatever Brackenby had become. He stayed behind the wall and did nothing. That doing nothing cost more than most labors. There is a vulgar heroism in charging forward, announcing oneself, demanding completion of the narrative. Restraint is less visible and often less praised. Yet on that ridge Elias understood that to know a place is not always to enter it. Sometimes it is to refuse the final theft of certainty. He took out Agnes's copied household list and read the names slowly, not aloud, just enough for the eyes to remember their order. Then he folded it and put it away. On the return path he found, in the hollow of the standing stone where the earlier list had been hidden, a new object wrapped in oilcloth. His pulse changed. Someone had been there after their last visit. He opened the cloth. Inside lay a small carved token of ash wood in the shape of a bell. No message, no threat, no thanks, only the bell. Mira, when he showed it to her, turned it over in her fingers and gave the verdict he had already reached. They know we know. Yes, and they have chosen not to kill you. That is a generous reading. It is the only one we have. He smiled. That evening, as the last light died over the square, they made ready to leave Brackenby for good. Elias packed only copies of the most necessary papers. Agnes's original letters he returned to the hidden flower chest in her kitchen. Alin's case book he rewrapped in cloth and placed back in the herb room. Lisa's gray notebook went beneath the desk board in the schoolhouse. Tomas's journal he set in the church tower niche behind the hammer mechanism. The town's own words, insofar as possible, should remain the town's. He kept only what the office required and what memory alone might distort. Mira watched him do this without comment until he finished. Then she said, "You are leaving them breadcrumbs." "No," he answered. "I am declining to steal relics. Same family." At dusk they walked the square one final time. The pump, the market stones, the inn door, the ash trees by the mayor's house, the school windows, the church tower against the darkening sky. Every place now carried double weight, what it had been in use and what it had become in abandonment. Elias realized then that Brackenby had not defeated loss. It had accepted a particular kind of it. The houses would rot, roofs would fail, graves would lie unattended. Orchard branches would go wild. In saving the people, the town had sacrificed its body. No story should cheapen that. Too many histories praise escape without counting the price. Brackenby had paid one. When full dark came, the bell sounded. One note, low, ancient. Not from the church tower, but from the chamber beneath St. Vay, carrying through damp ground and open air alike. Mira turned toward the east instantly. They know we leave tomorrow. Yes, or they are reminding us. Of what? She handed him the carved wooden token. That some signals are not for explanation. They listened until the note died. No second strike followed. That night Elias wrote the final private account he would never send to any office. He wrote it for himself, though later he would suspect he had written it also for whatever better part of history sometimes survives in hidden drawers. He wrote, "There was no war here. That is what makes Brackenby important. Had soldiers come with fire, the town would join the long, sad catalogue of places crushed by power. Had plague taken them, they would belong to God and physicians. Had famine emptied the houses, economists would later pretend to understand them. But no army burned Brackenby. No invading flag flew over the square. No official proclamation ordered its destruction. The town vanished because its people judged the approaching peace more dangerous than the visible risks of departure. That is harder for authority to forgive than rebellion. Rebellion confirms the ruler's drama. Withdrawal insults it." He stopped, flexed aching fingers, then continued. "They did not fight a war. They denied a system their availability. There may be no quieter form of defiance and few more effective." Near dawn he added one final line: "If this account is ever found, let the reader understand that mystery did not live in the disappearance. Mystery lived in the discipline required to make disappearance possible." The next morning they rode west. Halfway up the ridge Elias looked back once, disobeying the instruction Lysa had left for her children. But he was not one of her children, and he had not earned her discipline. Brackenby lay below him in thin morning light, small and ordinary and emptied of all the grandeur stories prefer. The roofs looked tired. The river shone. Smoke rose from nowhere. A perfect lost town for future liars. He almost laughed at that. Beside him Mira said, "When men tell this later, they will add soldiers. Yes, they will add plague too. Yes, some fool will make it a curse. Certainly. And what will you say?" He looked east, where the marsh hid its channels and the abandoned chapel of St. Vay held its underground bell. "I will say a town chose not to wait." Mira nodded as though that were enough, and perhaps it was. Years later, when Elias had grown grayer and more careful with his professional loyalties, he would hear versions of Brackenby told in inns and offices and winter parlors. In one version, the town sank overnight into marsh water because church sins had soured the ground. In another, soldiers took every last person to some northern campaign, and the empty houses were left as warning. In a third, a plague cart came under moonlight and no one who touched the place lived. In a fourth, a witch bell beneath the earth called the villagers down into old catacombs where they slept waiting for judgment. People admired these stories because they were dramatic and required no civic imagination. The truth remained less convenient. Now and then Elias would meet a carter or shepherd in distant districts who mentioned, in passing, a settlement somewhere east of nowhere whose people were reserved, well-organized, suspicious of officials, unusually good at teaching children routes, and disinclined to put their true name on any map. He never pressed. He had learned enough about loyalty to leave rumor uncaged. Once, many winters after, a parcel arrived at his rooms in the capital with no sender named. Inside lay only two objects: a child's map drawn in a firm, educated hand, and the ash-wood bell token he had once been given on the ridge, polished smoother by years of handling. The map showed hills, water, orchards, a chapel ruin, and a cluster of houses under a different name. But where most maps put the title in proud letters at the top, this one held a blank space. At the bottom, a single sentence had been written: "Home is the place that learned to walk." He kept that map hidden for the rest of his life. Not because he was afraid, though he was. Not because the mystery remained, though some mysteries should. He kept it because Brackenby had taught him the one lesson his own profession had almost trained out of him, that not every true place wishes to become legible, and that sometimes the most honorable record a witness can make is to know exactly where the line of disclosure ought to end. So the town vanished without a war, not into smoke, not into legend, not into holy punishment or royal triumph. It vanished into cooperation, into memory, into old roads, into children taught where to place their feet, into a bell rung once beneath the earth so frightened people could gather and become a procession instead of a target. And somewhere beyond the marsh, beyond the measurements of men who believed all land eventually submits to numbering, a community carried its dead in story, its future in disciplined hands, and its name only where names were safe. If you listen carefully, that is the part that lingers, not the mystery of where the town went, the harder, quieter marvel of how every person in it agreed to go.